Today's story features 3 tragic cases that reveal the darkest sides of trust, power, and safety. A woman is abducted and murdered by someone meant to protect her. A tragic shooting shatters the lives of a rising star and her loved ones, and an ordinary walk home turns into an unthinkable nightmare. These stories sparked outrage, changed communities, and serve as chilling reminders of the dangers lurking in plain sight. But before we dive in, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you've come to the right place. We upload daily, so make sure to subscribe and turn on all notifications so you never miss an upload. Alright, let's get into today's story. It was a quiet evening in early March 2021, and London was settling down for the night. The streets were less crowded than usual due to ongoing restrictions, with most people tucked away in their homes. But for Sarah Everard, the night was just an ordinary one. She'd spent some time with a friend, catching up and sharing stories. As she prepared to leave, she promised she'd get home safely, a promise that felt routine yet comforting. She put on her green rain jacket, slung her bag over her shoulder, and left, heading south through the familiar streets of Clapham. The walk home was just a little over 2 miles, a distance that many in the city would think nothing of covering by foot. Sarah, a bright, confident woman in her early 30s, knew these streets well and moved through them with a sense of ease. She spoke briefly on the phone with her boyfriend, a conversation filled with the mundane details of her day and plans for the weekend. As they said goodnight, the world around her seemed ordinary, a gentle silence falling over the night. Yet, as Sarah walked on, she noticed a growing sense of unease. In the darkness, every sound seemed to echo, each footstep amplified against the pavement. She brushed off the feeling, reminding herself that she had walked this route before. But still, the nagging feeling of being watched lingered. She clutched her belongings a little closer, quickening her pace. But then, in a split second, her path crossed with that of a stranger, a moment that would change everything. This was the last known point in Sarah's walk, and the last moments that anyone would hear from her. Her friends and family grew concerned when they couldn't reach her, and as hours passed without any word, worry turned into dread. The next morning, messages and calls flooded in from everyone close to her, all sharing the same anxious question. Where is Sarah? As minutes ticked by with no answer, the fear only intensified, the realization setting in that something was very wrong. The authorities quickly sprang into action, searching tirelessly for any trace of Sarah's whereabouts. They retraced her steps, combing through footage from nearby surveillance cameras, hoping for even the smallest lead. The footage from her last known location was chilling in its simplicity, showing Sarah simply walking, with no visible signs of trouble. But there was no footage after that. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but questions and mounting concern. News of her disappearance spread rapidly, sparking a wave of empathy and worry throughout the city. People shared Sarah's photo across social media, hoping to reach anyone who might have seen something, however small. The sense of urgency grew as more people learned of her disappearance, and soon it seemed that all of London was gripped by the same question: how could this happen? For days, friends, family, and even strangers gathered to search, each holding out hope that Sarah would be found safe. But as the investigation deepened, detectives uncovered unsettling leads that pointed to a darker turn. Their inquiries led them to a series of revelations that defied what anyone close to Sarah could have imagined, turning the investigation into one of the most challenging cases in recent history. The investigation was set in motion, and with each passing day, the urgency grew. Detectives dove into every lead, tracing Sarah's last steps with intense focus, leaving no stone unturned. A forensic team was deployed, meticulously examining Sarah's path home, combing through footage from every CCTV camera within range. They replayed each second of the available video, studying each frame for details that might explain her sudden disappearance. Hours passed, then days, with Sarah's family and friends growing ever more desperate for news. In the meantime, police received dozens of calls from people who thought they might have seen something, reports ranging from sightings of Sarah to vague descriptions of unfamiliar vehicles in the area. But these leads were mostly dead ends, frustrating the investigators who had hoped to find answers sooner. Then, a promising lead emerged. A particular stretch of CCTV footage captured what appeared to be a vehicle stopping near the area Sarah had last been seen. The vehicle's route and the timing seemed unusual, drawing it into sharper focus as detectives worked to identify the driver and unravel their intentions. The intensity of the investigation grew as police pieced together this new information, following the vehicle's path through various neighborhoods, hoping it would lead them to Sarah. The community watched anxiously as officers combed the area, leaving no possibility unchecked. Yet, each development led to more questions, the sense of mystery deepening. Soon, police released details to the public, urging anyone with knowledge of the vehicle or its driver to come forward. This plea brought more witnesses, each with small fragments of information, some sharing accounts of similar vehicles they'd seen or odd behaviors in the days prior. Each lead sent the team down a new path, with officers working around the clock, driven by the hope of bringing Sarah home. As information about the case spread, the story captivated the public, and the media followed closely, reporting every detail. The search for Sarah had transformed from a missing person investigation into something far more pressing. The investigation intensified, and in a striking turn, police identified a suspect who defied all initial assumptions. The individual in question was an officer himself, a member of the very system responsible for public safety. His connection to the case raised more questions than answers, casting a deep shadow over the investigation. Detectives reviewed his background, piecing together a troubling pattern that, until now, had slipped under the radar. Evidence began to reveal connections, each unsettling discovery chipping away at the initial sense of disbelief. Interviews with colleagues painted a complex picture, yet the signs seemed to point unmistakably to this officer's involvement. Detectives secured warrants, gathering additional information on his recent movements and associates. They retraced his steps around the night of Sarah's disappearance, uncovering a sequence of events that connected him to her last known location. Each piece of information they collected added layers to the case, bringing them closer to understanding what had happened that night. Meanwhile, as the investigation reached this critical point, news of the suspect's involvement shocked the public. This revelation sent ripples through the community, raising uncomfortable questions about trust and accountability. The headlines echoed with disbelief as people across the city grappled with the idea that someone entrusted with their safety could have been involved in such a devastating event. With public attention focused on every step of the investigation, detectives worked under intense pressure, determined to bring clarity and justice. As the suspect's identity and connection to law enforcement were revealed, a wave of reactions swept through the public. Shock quickly transformed into anger and grief, sparking protests and gatherings in Sarah's memory. Vigils were held across the country, where people shared stories, memories, and a collective determination to seek justice, not just for Sarah, but for all those affected by similar crimes. The case became a rallying point, exposing concerns over safety, power, and the systems designed to protect. At the center of this public outcry was a demand for change. People voiced concerns over their safety and questioned how someone with such responsibility could abuse their position so grievously. The case fueled discussions on long-standing issues, calling into question not only the structures in place, but also the processes that allowed such a crime to occur undetected. Women and men alike shared their experiences, building a wave of awareness around the often unspoken fears that permeated everyday life. Lawmakers and officials responded to this public pressure, promising reforms to address these concerns. Statements were issued, pledging reviews of protocols and thorough investigations into any misconduct. Leaders called for changes to restore public confidence, acknowledging the deep-seated concerns that the case had uncovered. Task forces were formed to examine the gaps in accountability, while community leaders sought to rebuild the sense of trust that had been profoundly shaken. Through it all, Sarah's story continued to resonate deeply, her life symbolizing the changes that many were now determined to see. The investigation pressed forward, with each step watched closely by the public, every new development bringing hope that justice would soon be served. As the investigation reached its final stages, the legal proceedings began, bringing Sarah's case into the solemn atmosphere of the courtroom. Witnesses were called, evidence was laid out meticulously, and the prosecution painted a clear picture of what had happened. Each testimony, each piece of evidence, reinforced the depth of the tragedy and the impact it had left on so many lives. Sarah's family watched, enduring each day with a quiet strength that moved everyone in attendance. The process was grueling, but it was necessary to ensure that justice would be served. When the verdict was announced, there was a heavy silence before the weight of justice was felt throughout the room. The sentence brought a sense of closure to some, though the path to healing for Sarah's loved ones and the community would be a long journey. Her case had reached its conclusion in court, but the reverberations of her story continued to echo far beyond. In the weeks that followed, changes began to take shape in policy and community practices. Awareness initiatives were launched, focusing on creating safer environments and strengthening the processes that protected the public. Communities came together to support one another, inspired by Sarah's memory and determined to turn their collective grief into meaningful action. Her life had ignited a movement that would bring about lasting change, a tribute to her legacy and a testament to the resilience of those who sought to honor her. Sarah's story became a part of a broader conversation, a call for vigilance and compassion, reminding people of the strength found in unity and the importance of ensuring safety for all. Though nothing could undo the loss, her legacy remained a guiding light, inspiring people across the nation to look out for one another and to strive for a future where such tragedies would never happen again. The next story is called Love, Fame, and Tragedy. It was the early hours of Valentine's Day, February 14, 2013. Inside Oscar Pistorius' high-security home in Pretoria, South Africa, what should have been a quiet night turned into a series of tragic events. The neighborhood, usually silent, was disturbed by sounds that would linger in the minds of those who heard them. The lights in Oscar's three-story house were mostly off, and outside, the gated walls stood as a fortress. Oscar Pistorius was a familiar figure in South Africa, known for his success in athletics and celebrated globally as an Olympic hero. But fame could not protect what was about to unfold within the confines of his home that night. Around 3 a.m., a loud piercing sound echoed through the neighborhood, one shot, and then a brief pause. More shots followed, each one louder than the last, breaking the silence in the dark. Some neighbors jolted awake, unsure if what they'd heard was real. There were muffled sounds, possibly voices, then silence. Moments later, one of the neighbors, deeply disturbed by what they heard, made a call to emergency services, reporting strange noises coming from Oscar's property. Others stayed indoors, gripped by confusion and fear, trying to convince themselves it was all a misunderstanding. Inside, Reeva Steenkamp, a model, law graduate, and beloved media personality, lay still. That night, she had been spending time with Oscar, her boyfriend. To the public, they had appeared as a picture-perfect couple. Reeva was known for her compassionate nature, her work advocating against gender-based violence, and her bright, gentle presence. But now, Reeva was unresponsive, and Oscar was alone with the devastating reality of the night. Within minutes, officers arrived, greeted by the sight of a visibly shaken Oscar. His emotions were evident, and he quickly relayed a story, one that would grip the world. He claimed he believed there was an intruder in the house, and in a moment of confusion, he had acted in self-defense. He explained that he had heard noises and, fearing for both his and Reeva's safety, fired through the closed bathroom door. But as investigators began examining the scene, some things didn't add up. The shots had been fired with precision, and the bathroom door bore the evidence of Oscar's actions. Bullet holes were scattered across it, and it was clear that the shots had been directed at someone inside. Neighbors who had heard the sounds shared conflicting accounts, noting that they had not only heard gunshots, but also sounds that seemed like a woman's voice. The investigators took their initial notes, gathering evidence, aware that this was not an ordinary case. As dawn broke over Pretoria, the news began to spread. Headlines were soon ablaze with the tragedy that had unfolded in the Pistorius household. Reporters gathered, capturing images of Oscar as he was escorted by officers, his face hidden but unmistakably filled with distress. In the days that followed, questions continued to arise, and people who had once celebrated Oscar's athletic accomplishments were now questioning everything they knew. Oscar's story, while heartfelt, did not erase the weight of the evidence. The bullets that had traveled through the bathroom door, the shell casings scattered across the floor, and the cold, hard facts of that morning all painted a picture of uncertainty. How could such a horrible event happen between two people who seemed so deeply connected? Rumors began circulating. Some believed Oscar's version of the events, sympathizing with his fear of crime, a common concern in South Africa's high-security areas. Others, however, doubted the plausibility of his account, questioning the series of decisions that led to the firing of those shots. Tensions rose, and as public opinion split, the narrative around Oscar Pistorius began to change. At his initial appearance before the court, Oscar maintained his version of events, asserting that the shooting was an accident, a tragic result of mistaken identity. He described how he'd awoken, heard a noise, and fearing an intruder, acted impulsively, firing without knowing who was behind the door. The description was haunting, and his words resonated with the fear many knew all too well. Yet, investigators were meticulous. Each piece of evidence seemed to add another layer of complexity. The trajectory of the bullets, the timing of the sounds, and the witness statements didn't fully align with Oscar's account. The case became not only about Reeva's tragic fate, but also about uncovering the truth of that night, a truth that eluded easy explanations. And so, as the legal battle unfolded, the world watched, waiting for answers. In the days following that night, Oscar Pistorius' testimony captured worldwide attention. Sitting before the press and investigators, he recounted his version of the events, his voice heavy and his face shadowed with emotion. The tale he told was one of split-second decisions, fear, and an instinct to protect. He explained that he was stirred by an unusual sound in the house, a noise he believed was an intruder breaking in. The dark, still hours and the memory of past security concerns weighed on his mind. And, overwhelmed with a sense of vulnerability, he had acted. Oscar described how he had felt a wave of panic when he thought Reeva was still in bed. The thought of an intruder in the house, potentially dangerous and unknown, drove him to grab his firearm from beneath the bed. On his way to the bathroom, his focus had been absolute, his senses heightened. Oscar explained how he had not stopped to question his surroundings further, convinced of an immediate threat. But despite the deeply personal account, his story was met with a degree of skepticism. Investigators had observed details in the layout of the house and bathroom, noting that anyone awake in that moment could likely have recognized the movements and presence of another person nearby. And then, there was the matter of Reeva's position in the locked bathroom, a detail that suggested she might have been there for some time before the shots were fired. Though Oscar's recounting was detailed, each element left room for uncertainty. As the investigation continued, law enforcement and forensic experts examined the physical evidence. Ballistics reports showed the path of each bullet and the precise height and angle from which they'd been fired. The trajectory didn't appear haphazard. Instead, the shot seemed intentional, targeted toward a specific area of the bathroom. This contrasted with Oscar's assertion that he fired in a blind panic, unable to see clearly. It raised more questions. Was this really the impulsive, defensive action he claimed, or was there something premeditated within those shots? The bathroom door itself bore the marks of that night's events. 4 distinct holes from the bullets told a story, one that Oscar struggled to counter. Neighbors had reported hearing sounds, a series of loud noises, and, notably, some mentioned a voice that could have been female. These claims complicated Oscar's statement. Had there been an argument, or was it truly the random, tragic mistake he described? The media frenzy grew, with news outlets around the world analyzing every word from his statement. As a symbol of determination and resilience, Oscar's achievements had inspired millions, and many wanted to believe his story. Yet, the layers of doubt grew with each new report, sparking fierce debate. Some argued that Oscar, accustomed to overcoming obstacles, was now finding himself in a situation that required yet another impossible feat to convince the world of his innocence. Others questioned if his strength and focus had instead contributed to a moment of tragic loss of control, one with irreversible consequences. Meanwhile, the image of Reeva, bright, full of promise, and devoted to advocacy work, stood in stark contrast to the grim details emerging from the scene. Friends and family remembered her warmth and drive, her kindness and aspirations to bring awareness to issues of safety and justice. This was what the world knew of Reeva, and now, people struggled to reconcile that with the events that had led to her death. The mounting questions led investigators to dig deeper. They examined text messages and interactions between Reeva and Oscar, searching for any hints of conflict or tension that might shed light on what happened. Within these messages, they found traces of disagreements and moments of unease. Reeva had expressed feelings of uncertainty about certain aspects of their relationship, confiding that she sometimes felt misunderstood or insecure. It was a far cry from the polished public image of a seamless romance, and though not conclusive, it added to the cloud of mystery surrounding the case. On the day of the first court hearing, the tension was palpable. Oscar arrived, shielded by his legal team and surrounded by media. With cameras flashing, he maintained a composed but visibly distressed appearance. Reporters captured his every movement, his expressions scrutinized as he entered the courthouse. Inside, his defense team presented him as a man haunted by his actions, but steadfast in his claim that he had made a mistake, a tragic, irreversible mistake born of fear. The court listened as he described the fear that had surged through him, claiming that his actions were not motivated by malice, but by instinct. He insisted that he had fired because he felt an urgent need to protect himself and his home. But even as he spoke, prosecutors probed deeper, examining inconsistencies and pressing for clarity. Each question posed was another layer peeled back, exposing the complexities of Oscar's actions that night. The day grew long as witnesses, forensic experts, and neighbors shared their recollections, each testimony adding to the narrative forming around Reeva's last hours. The courtroom was a tension-filled arena, every word dissected and analyzed. Oscar's testimony, though steady, couldn't erase the reality of the evidence. Evidence that seemed to tell a different story from the one he portrayed. As the hearing continued, Oscar's emotions would sometimes overcome him, tears evident in his eyes as he described his remorse. But for Reeva's family, the sorrow was overwhelming. They had lost someone irreplaceable, and no testimony could bring her back or erase the questions surrounding her final moments. Their faces remained a solemn reminder of the weight of loss, the grief that remained even as Oscar's supporters rallied behind him. Back outside, public reaction had reached a boiling point. Supporters of Oscar expressed sympathy, advocating for his innocence. Skeptics argued that too many details of his story didn't add up, painting a picture that didn't match his claims of a misunderstood tragedy. And so the lines were drawn, and people from all corners of the world followed the case, waiting for justice, or at the very least, a measure of closure. The court adjourned that day, but the debates surrounding Oscar Pistorius and Reeva Steenkamp had only just begun. As Oscar Pistorius' case moved forward, investigators faced the challenge of piecing together the events of that fateful night through layers of evidence. Each detail became crucial, from the positioning of bullet casings to the sounds heard by neighbors. Forensic experts analyzed the physical evidence meticulously, knowing that even the smallest discrepancy could be key to understanding the truth. In the bathroom, where Reeva Steenkamp's life was taken, investigators observed the aftermath of intense events. The door, a central piece of evidence, held 4 bullet holes that painted a picture of what might have happened. Ballistics experts examined the trajectory of each bullet, determining that the shots had been fired through the door with a precision that seemed to challenge Oscar's assertion of having acted in blind fear. The height and angle of each shot were noted, indicating they were not random, but targeted toward a specific area behind the closed door. These findings created a sense of intent that was difficult to reconcile with Oscar's testimony. The medical examiner's report revealed more information that complicated the narrative. Reeva had sustained injuries consistent with a close-range shooting. Her wounds were severe, and the sequence of the injuries suggested a moment of distress before her life was taken. The autopsy findings became a focal point for both sides of the case, with prosecutors arguing that these details pointed to a deliberate act, while the defense maintained that it was an unintentional tragedy. As the investigation progressed, investigators turned to technology to provide additional insights. Reeva's cell phone, found in the bathroom with her, was examined for clues about her state of mind and possible attempts to communicate during her final moments. Data analysis revealed a series of messages exchanged between her and Oscar in the days leading up to the incident. Some of these messages hinted at tension in their relationship, with Reeva expressing concerns and feelings of unease. She spoke of moments where she felt misunderstood, instances that created strain, even as they attempted to navigate their high-profile relationship. Oscar's legal team responded, highlighting the demands of their public lives and the unique pressures they faced as a couple. They portrayed Reeva and Oscar as two people trying to make things work under extraordinary circumstances, suggesting that any disagreements were normal and irrelevant to the tragedy. But the messages cast a shadow, offering a glimpse into moments that weren't visible to the outside world. They hinted at a complex relationship, one that might have been far from perfect, as the public had believed. Meanwhile, the crime scene itself continued to raise questions. Neighbors had reported sounds before the gunshots, sounds that they described as raised voices or possibly a woman's screams. These testimonies were chilling, suggesting that there might have been an argument before the shooting. The neighbors' accounts added weight to the prosecution's theory of a confrontation turned tragic, a claim that countered Oscar's story of waking to a sudden noise and reacting out of pure instinct. In court, the prosecution presented their case with these facts in mind. They argued that Oscar's actions were not merely those of someone afraid, but of someone caught in a moment of intense emotion. They described a scenario where an argument could have escalated, leading to the decision to fire through the door. With the physical evidence in hand, they painted a scene that suggested Oscar had every opportunity to recognize Reeva's presence and avoid the tragic outcome. But Oscar's defense team countered with force, challenging each point raised. They argued that the entire case was based on assumptions and conjecture, emphasizing Oscar's state of mind at the time. His supporters maintained that Oscar was simply a person who had made a terrible mistake, and that the prosecution was attempting to build a case on circumstantial evidence rather than concrete facts. His defense highlighted his fear of crime, a fear not uncommon among residents in the area, and his prior experiences with threats to his safety. They insisted that his actions were the unfortunate result of a misunderstanding, a response fueled by instinct and anxiety. The legal proceedings grew more intense as each side continued to argue their case. Witnesses were called to testify, including friends, neighbors, and forensic experts, each one bringing a new perspective. Reeva's friends described her as a strong, intelligent woman with a deep commitment to issues she cared about. Her advocacy work against domestic violence had earned her respect and admiration. Those close to her testified about her character, painting a picture of a woman who believed in justice and whose life had been cut short in an act that contradicted everything she stood for. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of the case bore heavily on everyone involved. The court became a battleground, with each piece of evidence hotly debated. The bathroom door was brought in as an exhibit, allowing the court to see firsthand the marks left by the bullets. Experts demonstrated the angles and positions of the shots, recreating scenarios that each side argued supported their version of events. For the prosecution, it was a demonstration of clear intent. For the defense, it was evidence of a desperate reaction to an imagined threat. Outside the courthouse, the case continued to capture global attention. Supporters of both Oscar and Reeva gathered, with banners and signs expressing support for justice. News outlets followed every development, capturing the emotional toll the case took on everyone involved. As more details emerged, the world found itself divided, with some sympathizing with Oscar's claims of fear and self-protection, while others stood firmly on the side of justice for Reeva. Inside the courtroom, the testimonies continued. The medical experts described Reeva's final moments with sensitivity, explaining the nature of her injuries without dwelling on the more unsettling aspects. They emphasized the importance of justice for her, presenting the case as one not only about Oscar, but about Reeva and the many people affected by her loss. At the end of each day, the families of both Oscar and Reeva would leave the courtroom, faces solemn and spirits weary. For Reeva's family, the proceedings served as a painful reminder of a life lost too soon, a life they would never see fulfilled. For Oscar's family, it was a grueling process of defending someone they loved, someone they believed was genuinely remorseful and misunderstood. With each testimony and argument, the stakes grew higher, and the sense of anticipation weighed heavily on the court. The case had reached a point where every word, every piece of evidence held the potential to sway opinions. For the legal teams, it was a matter of navigating not only the facts, but the perceptions that had taken hold in the public's mind. The days that followed would bring even more revelations as the world continued to wait for a verdict. The trial moved into its most gripping phase as both sides brought forth witnesses to solidify their cases. The courtroom was tense, charged with the weight of testimonies from those closest to Reeva Steenkamp and Oscar Pistorius, as well as from forensic experts who provided the finer details of that night. Each statement, each recollection, felt as though it held the potential to tip the scales. Oscar took the stand, and his testimony became one of the most memorable moments of the trial. His voice shook as he recounted the events in vivid detail, insisting that he'd believed an intruder was behind that closed bathroom door. In recounting that night, He described the confusion and fear that had gripped him, feelings he claimed had propelled him to act out of instinct rather than malice. With trembling words, he recalled how he had called out, hoping the person behind the door would identify themselves before he fired. But as he spoke, his gaze was unsteady, and the courtroom watched him with a mix of sympathy and scrutiny. The defense leaned heavily on Oscar's version of events, highlighting his reputation as a sports figure who had risen above physical challenges to reach heights few could imagine. They painted him as a person dedicated to inspiring others, and his lawyer reminded the court of his public acts of courage, moments when he had demonstrated composure and resilience. In this light, his actions that night seemed like an aberration, a single, tragic decision clouded by fear. Yet, the prosecution did not hold back. Prosecutors cross-examined Oscar with a focus that was relentless and meticulous, challenging his narrative at every turn. They pointed to the evidence that contradicted his claims, emphasizing the placement of the shots and the level of precision involved. In their view, the decision to fire 4 times could not be ascribed to an error. Their questions highlighted the contrast between Oscar's athletic discipline and his account of panicking uncontrollably in his own home. If he was as highly attuned to his surroundings as he claimed, could he really have acted with such haste? They asked without realizing who was in the bathroom. As the prosecution dug deeper, they questioned Oscar about the relationship dynamics between him and Reeva. While the defense had argued that they were a loving couple, the prosecution introduced witnesses who spoke of arguments and moments of tension, suggesting a side to their relationship that the public had not seen. Close friends and acquaintances of Reeva described instances when she had confided her doubts, moments of insecurity she had expressed about certain aspects of the relationship. To the prosecution, these testimonies hinted at a possible motive, raising the question of whether the events of that night had stemmed from more than a mere accident. The court also heard from neighbors who claimed they had heard sounds that night, sounds they identified as raised voices, possibly those of a man and a woman in a heated exchange. Each neighbor's testimony was subject to intense scrutiny, with the defense arguing that memory, especially in high-stress situations, could be unreliable. Yet, these testimonies carried a haunting weight, painting a picture of conflict that might have taken place behind closed doors. A particularly compelling testimony came from a forensic psychologist who analyzed Oscar's behavior and emotional state in the aftermath. The psychologist's report noted Oscar's tendency to act decisively, especially under stress, a trait that had served him well in the athletic world. The prosecution argued that this trait might also explain the tragic outcome, suggesting that he could have quickly made a decision he later came to regret. This testimony was nuanced, treading carefully between psychological insight and forensic detail, but its implication lingered in the air. The defense brought in their own psychologist, who described Oscar as a person deeply impacted by his past experiences with trauma, pointing to his upbringing and specific incidents that had left a profound impression on his psyche. They argued that his fear of crime and his vulnerability, particularly as a public figure, had made him more likely to act impulsively in what he perceived as a life-threatening situation. The defense psychologist spoke of post-traumatic stress, painting Oscar as someone who felt isolated, targeted, and vulnerable, a state of mind that they argued could have easily triggered his actions that night. The legal battle reached a peak with the forensic analysis of Reeva's final moments. Medical experts described her injuries with care, balancing the need to provide essential information with sensitivity. They presented evidence indicating that Reeva's wounds were consistent with someone attempting to protect themselves, and it was suggested that she might have been aware of what was happening, even if only briefly. The courtroom was silent as the medical examiner outlined the sequence of events, each detail another piece of the story of what Reeva had endured. Her family's expressions of sorrow were palpable, and many in the audience felt the weight of her loss as these difficult facts were presented. When the defense cross-examined the forensic experts, they sought to cast doubt on the prosecution's interpretation. They argued that the evidence was inconclusive, that the scene could not definitively indicate what either Reeva or Oscar had been thinking or feeling. For every point raised by the prosecution, the defense provided a counterpoint, emphasizing the ambiguity of the evidence and maintaining that Oscar had acted out of mistaken fear rather than with harmful intent. As each witness stepped down, the court felt the emotional toll of the trial. Reeva's family sat quietly, their grief evident. The tragedy that had taken Reeva away from them was now playing out in full view, every detail exposed to the court's scrutiny. Oscar's family, meanwhile, remained supportive, holding fast to their belief in his innocence. They too felt the burden of the accusations, and their expressions revealed a complex blend of loyalty and distress. Outside the courtroom, the public waited anxiously for updates. Supporters from both sides continued to gather, each group steadfast in their beliefs. Media coverage of the trial amplified the debates, with opinion pieces, interviews, and expert analyses dissecting every facet of the case. For many, it had become a defining moment, not only for those involved but for the issues it raised around justice, accountability, and the complexities of human relationships. The trial drew to a close with final statements from both sides, each one powerful and poignant. The prosecution argued with conviction, seeking justice for Reeva Steenkamp and insisting that the evidence spoke for itself. They asked the court to consider the impact of her loss on her family, friends, and community, and to see past the claims of a tragic mistake. The defense, however, pleaded for understanding, for compassion, and for the possibility that Oscar had simply been a man who made an irreversible decision in a moment of profound confusion. In the final hours, the courtroom was filled with a quiet tension. The judge listened intently to the arguments and to the gravity of each word spoken. The weight of the decision was clear to everyone present, a decision that would determine not only Oscar's future, but also offer a measure of closure, or perhaps further questions, for Reeva's family. When the final day of the trial arrived, the courtroom was silent, filled with a sense of anticipation that only grew as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. All eyes were fixed on Oscar Pistorius as he awaited the decision that would define his future. The courtroom held its collective breath as the judge, after months of testimony, forensic analysis, and emotional accounts, began to lay out the findings. The judge recounted the evidence with careful neutrality, addressing each argument presented by both the prosecution and the defense. She acknowledged the physical evidence, the testimony from neighbors and forensic experts, and the detailed psychological assessments that had painted contrasting portraits of Oscar. She referenced the nuances of the case, Oscar's claim of mistaken identity, the tragic sequence of events, and the prosecution's argument of a deliberate act. It was clear that this decision was not one taken lightly. As she announced the verdict, the room remained utterly still. Oscar was found guilty of culpable homicide, a ruling that left the courtroom divided. While he was acquitted of premeditated actions, the court determined that he was responsible for the actions that led to Reeva Steenkamp's tragic loss. Emotions rippled through the room, some feeling the decision was too lenient, while others saw it as a fair acknowledgement of a complex and deeply unfortunate series of events. Oscar's face was a mixture of visible relief and regret, while Reeva's family sat in somber reflection, still bearing the weight of her loss. In the weeks that followed, Oscar's sentencing became the next point of focus. As he awaited the decision on his sentence, public debate continued to stir, with opinions split on whether justice had truly been served. Oscar's defense team argued for leniency, emphasizing his lack of prior criminal history and the emotional toll the trial had taken on him. They portrayed him as a man haunted by his actions and argued that his remorse was genuine. The prosecution, however, pushed for a sentence that would reflect the irreversible impact on Reeva's loved ones and the community. They reminded the court that, regardless of intent, Reeva's family had lost someone irreplaceable. Her mother, June Steenkamp, spoke before the court, her words measured but filled with deep sorrow. She expressed the pain of losing a daughter so full of promise and compassion, and the sense of injustice she felt that Reeva's voice was silenced in such a sudden, heartbreaking way. At the sentencing, the court considered each perspective, weighing Oscar's remorse and the defense's call for compassion against the need for accountability. Ultimately, Oscar was given a prison sentence, a decision that reflected both the gravity of the tragedy and the complex nature of the case. As he was led away, there was a palpable sense of finality, but also lingering questions about the events of that night and the choices that had brought them to this point. In the months that followed, Oscar's story continued to spark conversations and debates, both in South Africa and beyond. News outlets covered each development, from his time served to his attempts at appeal. The case became a symbol of the challenges in understanding human actions under pressure, a study of how split-second decisions can alter lives irreversibly. For Reeva's family, however, the end of the trial was only the beginning of a long road to healing. They remembered her not as a victim, but as the bright, compassionate person she had been. They honored her life through her legacy, creating a foundation in her name to support causes she had been passionate about, including advocacy for justice and protection for vulnerable individuals. This work became their way of coping with their loss, a means of ensuring that Reeva's spirit lived on, bringing light even after her passing. Oscar's family also grappled with the outcome, facing the complex emotions of loss and sorrow for all involved. For them, the ordeal had been a difficult journey as they witnessed someone they loved go through a highly publicized legal battle, one that left them questioning the fine lines between responsibility and tragedy. Years later, the case remains a topic of reflection and discussion, one that raises questions about justice, accountability, and the impact of decisions made in moments of heightened emotion. The case is remembered not just for its legal proceedings, but for the ways it highlighted the fragility of human relationships and the consequences of actions taken in an instant. And though the courtroom drama has ended, Reeva Steenkamp's memory continues to be honored, her life celebrated as one of compassion, beauty, and courage. In the end, those who knew her hope that her legacy will serve as a reminder to cherish life, to seek understanding, and to remember that even in tragedy, there can be a path to healing. The next and final story is called The Walk That Turned Fatal. It was late on a cool September evening in 2012 when Jill Mager stepped out of a lively bar in Melbourne's bustling Brunswick neighborhood. She'd been enjoying an evening with friends, unwinding after a busy week, and sharing laughs over drinks. The streets buzzed with an energy unique to this part of town, known for its late-night cafes, music, and the steady hum of people lingering outside local bars, savoring the weekend. Brunswick felt alive and secure, a place where the faint glow of streetlights seemed to promise the ordinary safety of home. Jill was no stranger to this area. She walked these streets often, especially on weekends, and she was at ease even as the clock inched closer to 1:30 a.m. She'd said goodbye to her friends, smiling and waving as she stepped onto Sydney Road, planning to make the short walk home alone. Her route was familiar, taking her past cafes and corner stores that dotted the way. As Jill walked, the night seemed peaceful. People drifted past in twos and threes, some laughing and others quiet. She sent a quick text to her husband, Tom, letting him know she was on her way back. It was something she'd done countless times, a reassuring note in the late-night hours that helped bridge the short distance home. But as she strolled along the road, the occasional flicker of headlights from passing cars cast long shadows over the pavement. The streets gradually emptied, and the quiet settled in. Then, near a brightly lit shop window, a figure appeared on the sidewalk. At first, it was just a shadow, an indistinct shape moving steadily closer. Jill, caught up in her own thoughts, barely noticed until she was within earshot of the stranger, who approached with an unsettling familiarity. Their conversation was brief, almost too casual, yet something in the man's demeanor made Jill tense. In the moments that followed, the silence of the early morning air thickened. For reasons that would become devastatingly clear later, the final minutes of her walk home would unravel into a nightmare. A grainy CCTV camera perched above a storefront caught a brief glimpse of the encounter, capturing Jill in the distance talking to the man before she turned away, continuing down the sidewalk with quickened steps. In that short sequence, the camera would preserve the last known image of Jill Mager alive. Back at home, Tom Mager waited for Jill. It was not unusual for her to be out late, but an instinctive unease grew as the minutes ticked past. He texted her again, a simple, "You close?" message, but received no reply. As the minutes bled into hours, Tom's concern deepened. His mind flickered through logical explanations. Maybe her phone had died, maybe she'd stopped somewhere, or lost track of time. But the city's steady stillness, the empty quiet of their home in the early morning, felt unsettling. Tom's worries soon morphed into dread. He began calling friends, asking if Jill had stayed behind, hoping someone might know her whereabouts. One by one, the responses came in, each confirming that she had left the bar alone, intending to walk home. He checked his phone again, scrolling through missed messages, but there was nothing from Jill. Each unanswered call, each minute that passed, seemed to steal away hope. As the first light of dawn seeped into the sky, Tom's distress turned to fear. He reached out to the local police station, recounting the details of Jill's night, her walk home, and the inexplicable silence that had followed. He described her route, the clothes she was wearing, and the way she had casually let him know she'd be home soon. His mind clung to the hope that there was an explanation. Maybe she'd fallen asleep somewhere safe or lost her phone. But as the police filed the missing persons report, Tom could feel the walls of dread closing in. When the police arrived, they scanned the area, questioning people who might have been nearby or who might have seen Jill during the hours after she left the bar. Officers examined the CCTV footage from nearby shops, tracking her steps as she made her way down Sydney Road. The footage revealed those chilling final moments, showing her talking to the unknown man, her body language calm, yet cautious. They watched as she moved just beyond the camera's frame, disappearing into the early morning shadows. Word of Jill's disappearance spread quickly. The community of Brunswick, tight-knit and vibrant, rallied around Tom, hoping with him that Jill would soon return. Flyers with her photo covered street poles and shop windows, her image staring back at passersby with a quiet smile that had once radiated warmth and familiarity. Journalists picked up the story, and within hours, news of Jill's disappearance was circulating widely, capturing the city's attention. Local news anchors spoke of a woman who had simply vanished during an ordinary walk home. In the following hours, detectives began piecing together fragments of the night. They spoke with her friends and scoured the CCTV recordings, analyzing every second for clues. Jill had been a vibrant, beloved part of her community, a colleague, a friend, a wife. Her sudden absence left a palpable void, casting a somber shadow over the bustling streets of Melbourne. Police intensified their search, retracing her steps, hoping for any sign of her. As they pursued the few leads they had, they became aware of an alarming figure lurking in Jill's final moments on Sydney Road. An unrecognizable face, just clear enough in the footage to spark suspicion. This man, unknown to her friends and family, had approached Jill, engaging her in a fleeting conversation. The brief interaction, combined with her sudden disappearance, felt ominous, pointing towards something darker, more malevolent. The police now had a face, albeit a grainy, indistinct one, but it was a start. Tom, too, felt the heavy weight of the unknown, a relentless ache gnawing at him with every passing hour. He remained close to the investigation, working with police, sharing details of Jill's habits, her character, and any small clue that might help. The search felt like a desperate chase, each second stretching agonizingly as they raced against time. Days passed, and the investigation took on a new urgency. Officers were pulling in all available resources, searching through hours of footage, calling on witnesses, and interviewing locals who might have crossed paths with Jill that night. The stakes grew higher as the unsettling image of the stranger on Sydney Road continued to haunt their search, his presence a chilling reminder of how quickly the familiar can turn to the unthinkable. As the hours stretched into days, the city of Melbourne watched with bated breath. Jill Meagher's absence hung over Brunswick like a storm cloud, and every corner seemed touched by the chilling possibility of what could have happened to her. Friends, family, and community members took to the streets, searching every alleyway, abandoned lot, and quiet stretch of road, hoping to find any trace of her. Police began expanding their efforts, canvassing businesses along Sydney Road, questioning anyone who might have seen or heard anything unusual in those early morning hours. The gravity of the situation had drawn a devoted team of detectives who meticulously combed through the growing pile of leads. With a single blurry face caught on a security camera, they had the beginnings of a mystery that only deepened as they sought answered. That faint image, which showed the stranger interacting briefly with Jill, became the focal point of their efforts. Detectives leaned heavily on the footage, hoping to sharpen their picture of this unidentified man. But technology could only take them so far. They needed witnesses, someone who might remember seeing Jill or her possible companion that night. Tom Meagher, meanwhile, clung to hope even as the days passed with no word of Jill. He'd sat through hours of questioning, recounting every detail he could think of about her night out, what she'd been wearing, even her usual routes home. Friends who had been with Jill that evening provided their accounts, painting a picture of a normal night out that had taken a chillingly abnormal turn. As the police followed these leads, it became clear that nothing was straightforward. Everyone was left grappling with the realization that someone could vanish from a well-lit street in the middle of a vibrant neighborhood, leaving barely a trace. The police intensified their presence, sweeping through Brunswick with a surge of resources. They stopped people on the streets, questioned shop owners, and examined CCTV footage from nearby streets, hoping to catch the man from the video on another camera. But the stranger seemed to have vanished as completely as Jill had. The tension grew with each passing hour, and the people of Brunswick began to worry. The familiar streets now felt shadowed, every passerby a potential suspect in the minds of friends and neighbors who just days before had thought they knew one another. The police team pressed forward, but with each round of questions, each phone call, and each new angle, they found only dead ends. Investigators released still images from the security footage to the public, hoping someone might recognize the figure, but days went by without substantial leads. The pressure was mounting, and the eyes of Melbourne were on the police force, expecting answers and above all, hoping for Jill's safe return. Then, a break came. One of the officers, who had been re-examining footage from a store on the edge of Sydney Road, spotted something they hadn't noticed before: a car idling near the corner just minutes after Jill was last seen on camera. The car had been parked in a shadowed area, barely visible, and though they couldn't make out the driver, its presence raised suspicions. The timing and location were too close to be a coincidence. Investigators immediately set out to identify the vehicle, looking for any distinguishing features that might help track it down. As the police chased this new lead, hope stirred in the community, and Tom clung to the possibility that Jill might still be found. Volunteers gathered, joining friends and family in a renewed search, passing out flyers, posting on social media, and encouraging anyone who might know something to come forward. The streets were lined with photos of Jill, each flyer a plea for information and a reminder that she was still missing. But the more the police uncovered, the darker the picture became. The car, though difficult to identify, seemed to trace a path through the city that matched the movements they had mapped out for Jill and the stranger. And as they worked to track down the vehicle's owner, a nagging detail from the initial footage took on new significance. The man seen speaking with Jill hadn't been just a stranger passing by. Investigators discovered he was lingering, almost as if waiting for her, a fact that deepened their suspicions. A police spokesperson issued a statement to the media, urging the public to remain vigilant and report anything unusual, no matter how small it might seem. Community members responded by posting about the case on every social media platform, trying to keep Jill's disappearance in the public's mind. People shared theories, speculated about the identity of the mysterious man, and expressed frustration at how little information had come to light. Then, as the investigation pushed forward, another piece of the puzzle emerged. A woman came forward, reporting that she'd been approached by a man fitting the description of the figure in the footage just hours before Jill had disappeared. According to her, the man had acted oddly, standing too close, his gaze unsettling. She'd quickly excused herself and walked away, not thinking much of it at the time. But when she saw the news about Jill, she realized her experience might not have been isolated. This encounter sparked a wave of similar reports from other women who described similar run-ins in the weeks leading up to Jill's disappearance, each sharing the unnerving feeling they'd had during these interactions. The stranger was no longer just a figure on a grainy camera. He was someone real, someone known for strange behavior around the area. The community's collective memory stirred, and more people began recalling details, times they might have seen him lingering around Sydney Road. The police continued piecing together these accounts, slowly building a profile that pointed to something far more sinister than a random encounter. Detectives worked tirelessly, pressing these threads together and interviewing anyone who might have been in the area that night. Meanwhile, forensic specialists combed through every available recording, every bit of evidence, hoping for the smallest breakthrough. The weight of the case pressed down on the police force, their resolve growing even as each lead brought its own fresh set of complications. It became clear that the figure in the footage was key to solving the mystery, and the department would not rest until they had answers. With the case drawing so much public attention, Melbourne's law enforcement faced immense pressure from all sides. Friends, family members, and the community at large all waited with a mixture of dread and hope, each day that passed making it harder to hold on to the ladder. Tom's days had become a blur of conversations with detectives, sleepless nights, and the devastating ache of not knowing where Jill was. In those moments of quiet, when he allowed himself to imagine the worst, he'd push back the thoughts, forcing himself to focus on the next meeting, the next update, the next shred of hope. Then, in a turn of events that no one expected, a breakthrough arrived. The police managed to trace the suspicious vehicle to a local resident, a man whose name had surfaced in previous unrelated investigations. The car's owner fit the rough description that had been pieced together from the witness accounts and the grainy images from the night of Jill's disappearance. It was the most promising lead they'd had in days, and with this information, the police moved quickly. When they located and questioned the man, he initially denied knowing anything about Jill. But under pressure, inconsistencies in his story began to surface. Detectives scrutinized his every response, noticing the way he hesitated, the way his gaze shifted when certain questions were asked. There was a darkness to his story, fragments that didn't quite add up. The man's account of his whereabouts began to crumble, each small detail unraveling, until he could no longer maintain the pretense. As the interrogation wore on, the police sensed they were on the verge of something significant. As the questioning continued, detectives felt the weight of the investigation shifting. The man, whose vague answers and nervous demeanor had already raised suspicion, was now faltering under scrutiny. He'd maintained an air of calm early on, insisting he knew nothing about the case, but as the police gently pressed, inconsistencies in his statements became undeniable. The officers didn't need a confession, not yet. They needed just enough to break through the carefully crafted facade he seemed desperate to maintain. Investigators had already gathered information about his background. This wasn't his first encounter with law enforcement, and a history of alarming behavior had left a traceable pattern across several records. Each file they examined painted a picture of a man with troubling tendencies, known for intimidation, particularly toward women, around the city. These incidents had never escalated to a case like Jill's, but his name had surfaced enough times that it unsettled even the most experienced officers. Behind closed doors, the detectives discussed their options. The public had been following every turn in the case, and the pressure to find Jill weighed heavily on everyone involved. Each officer knew that moving forward with the evidence at hand could either crack the case wide open or risk alienating the public's trust. But they had one advantage: the CCTV footage showing this man with Jill that night. With the images as their foundation, they crafted their next approach, careful to avoid rushing a process that could jeopardize the investigation. Armed with these strategies, they resumed the interrogation, focusing on the inconsistencies in his timeline. The man, growing visibly more agitated, began stumbling over details had previously seemed certain of. Detectives seized the moment, leaning in on the discrepancies and gradually unraveling the narrative he'd tried to construct. Every pause, every shift in his body language was noted carefully as they built a profile that felt closer to the truth with each passing hour. Outside the station, Melbourne's streets were filled with quiet anticipation. The community that had once been vibrant and alive now held its breath, bracing for news that could change everything. Jill's family and friends maintained a visible presence, urging anyone with information to come forward. Their faces, etched with worry and exhaustion, had become symbols of the public's grief. They spoke in press conferences and media interviews, keeping the momentum going as the police worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Back in the interrogation room, the man's defenses continued to crumble. Detectives introduced a piece of evidence they hadn't revealed before: a shoe print found near the scene of Jill's disappearance. This was no ordinary print, but one that matched the sole of a specific shoe brand known for its distinctive pattern. When asked about his footwear, the man hesitated, casting a quick glance down at his own shoes, and the brief flicker of recognition was enough to raise even more alarms among the investigators. They pressed him for details about his movements that night, and each answer seemed less certain than the last. The breakthrough came when investigators managed to locate an acquaintance who remembered seeing the man the night of Jill's disappearance. This witness had no personal connection to Jill, but recalled an encounter that seemed almost incidental. He had seen the man near Sydney Road, lingering in a way that felt unusual, even for him. The witness described him as uneasy, distracted, pacing along the street before disappearing down an alley. It was a small but significant detail, enough to place him squarely in the vicinity around the time Jill had vanished. When detectives confronted him with this information, the man finally cracked. He admitted to being in the area, but insisted it was coincidental, claiming he had been out for a late-night walk. His tone, however, had shifted from one of denial to one of deflection, a subtle but telling change that indicated the walls were closing in. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that he was struggling to maintain his story. In the days that followed, investigators dug deeper, gathering more witness statements and forensic evidence to solidify their case. They meticulously retraced his steps, mapping his movements throughout the night, matching them against surveillance footage from different locations. Each frame, every timestamp, slowly connected the dots, creating a path that pointed directly toward the last place Jill had been seen. Finally, a critical piece of evidence surfaced. A discarded item, found near a stretch of road not far from where the police believed Jill had encountered the man, matched something she'd been carrying that night. This find marked a turning point, a physical link that could not be easily dismissed. It wasn't long before a forensic analysis confirmed it was indeed Jill's, a discovery that bolstered the investigators' resolve. With mounting evidence, police obtained a search warrant for the man's home. Inside, they found items that raised immediate suspicion: clothing that matched the description given by witnesses, as well as objects that suggested a familiarity with the area where Jill had disappeared. Forensics teams carefully cataloged each item, combing through them for traces that could further solidify the case. As the evidence accumulated, the detectives knew they were on the cusp of uncovering the truth, a truth that would soon reveal itself in stark, undeniable detail. The pressure on the suspect intensified, and finally, he confessed to certain details, though carefully avoiding direct acknowledgement of his involvement. His words came out in fragments, small admissions, each one shedding light on a grim reality that the investigators had feared. Yet even now, he danced around the full scope of what had happened, his reluctance to admit everything a final barrier the police were determined to break. With the pieces falling into place, the police prepared to move forward, ensuring every element of their case was airtight. The story they were piecing together painted a dark picture, one that would leave Melbourne reeling. With mounting evidence, the authorities finally had enough to formally charge the man they had so intensely scrutinized. As the details emerged, the public's shock deepened. This was a crime that had haunted the community, its cruelty casting a shadow over Melbourne that few could shake. The arrest itself was quiet, executed with precision, as detectives brought him in for further questioning under formal suspicion. In the hours that followed, the man's composure, already frayed, started to unravel. Confronted with the forensic evidence gathered from his home and personal items, he could no longer rely on vague answers and deflections. The detectives laid out each piece methodically, walking him through the evidence, connecting dots that pointed directly to his involvement in Jill's last known moments. At first, he denied everything, his denials forceful, yet hollow. But as they continued to press, recounting the accounts from witnesses and the surveillance footage that captured him on Sydney Road that night, his responses grew increasingly uncertain. He shifted in his seat, glancing away from the investigators as if trying to distance himself from the truth. Bit by bit, he seemed to realize that his story was crumbling, that he had been cornered in a way he couldn't escape. The forensic evidence alone was a powerful case. Detectives had found fibers that matched Jill's clothing, along with other details that could not be dismissed. Each point they raised felt like a weight, bearing down on him, leaving him less room to maneuver. Faced with the overwhelming details, he began to falter, his confidence giving way to frustration. The detectives watched as his carefully constructed persona began to fracture, revealing glimpses of the man beneath, a man who could not escape the consequences of his actions. As the hours wore on, the suspect's attempts to deny and distract grew weaker, his voice quieter. He finally admitted to being on Sydney Road that night, acknowledging his presence in the area, but trying to downplay his intentions. Yet his admissions came in stages, each one a small step closer to the truth, his attempts to keep his secrets intact slipping through his fingers. Meanwhile, as the legal proceedings advanced, Jill's family and friends faced the grueling process of piecing together the loss. Each day brought a new layer of heartache, yet the support they received from the community was steadfast. People from all walks of life reached out, offering words of comfort and remembrance, each tribute painting a portrait of Jill's kindness and strength. Back in the police station, the interrogation continued. The detectives, sensing his resolve had all but collapsed, began to push harder, piecing together the chain of events from that night. They pressed him about each minute of his timeline, his every step mapped against the footage, every word cross-referenced with witness statements. The picture became clearer, even as he continued to resist giving a full confession. In the courtroom, the prosecution laid out its case with unyielding precision, presenting the evidence that the police had gathered over the weeks of exhaustive investigation. Each new piece of information painted a darker picture, one that forced everyone in attendance to confront the depths of what had happened. The jurors listened in silence, each detail adding to the narrative that now seemed undeniable. As the trial stretched on, the evidence continued to mount. Witnesses took the stand, describing encounters with the man in the weeks leading up to Jill's disappearance. They recalled unsettling interactions, moments that, at the time, seemed only mildly strange but now carried a far more ominous weight. Each witness added to the growing sense that this was not a random act, but part of a pattern of behavior that had long gone unchecked. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the timeline, suggesting gaps that might imply a different outcome. But with each challenge, the prosecution's case only strengthened. Expert witnesses, including forensic analysts and crime scene specialists, laid out their findings in meticulous detail, guiding the jury through the forensic evidence that had been so painstakingly gathered. The shoe print, the fibers, and the timeline all aligned, leaving little room for doubt. In the end, the man's own admissions proved to be one of the most compelling pieces of evidence. His reluctance to fully confess, coupled with his half-admissions, painted a picture of a person unable to come to terms with his actions, yet equally incapable of escaping the truth. As he sat in the courtroom, the weight of the evidence bearing down, he no longer seemed to be the evasive figure from the beginning of the investigation, but a man fully aware of the reckoning that lay ahead. Jill's family watched each day as the proceedings unfolded, their pain met with a quiet strength that inspired the community. They'd come face to face with the unimaginable, yet their resolve to see justice done never wavered. The final days of the trial brought an air of solemn anticipation. Each person in the courtroom knew they were approaching a moment that would determine the future of the man who had so profoundly disrupted a community. As the evidence closed in, the prosecution gave its final arguments, drawing together weeks of testimony, forensic details, and witness accounts into a damning narrative. The jurors listened intently, their expressions heavy with the weight of what they'd witnessed, each aware that their decision would bring either a long-sought sense of closure or a painful new chapter for Jill's loved ones. When it was the defense's turn, they urged the jurors to question the interpretations of the evidence, hinting at what they called gaps in the case. But by now, the picture was clear. The defendant's demeanor, his reluctance to fully admit his actions, and the overwhelming forensic links had created a story that left little room for reasonable doubt. With the closing statements delivered, the court fell into a tense silence as the jurors began their deliberations. Outside the courthouse, the city held its collective breath. Friends, family members, and supporters gathered, anxiously awaiting a verdict. Many had been following the case from the start, feeling a connection to Jill's story, moved by the strength of her family and inspired by the relentless efforts of those who sought justice on her behalf. News stations covered the courthouse closely, reporters relaying every update, while the community waited in vigil, hoping that this long, painful journey was finally reaching its conclusion. When the jury returned, the atmosphere in the courtroom was almost palpable, thick with anticipation and the silent prayers of those seated. The foreperson stood and read out the verdict, guilty on all charges. A wave of relief and quiet satisfaction washed over the room. Jill's family clutched each other's hands, their faces a mixture of sorrow and resolve as they absorbed the outcome. Justice, while unable to undo the harm, had been served, and the person responsible would face the consequences of his actions. As the sentence was passed, there was a moment of reflection, a sense that while justice had been done, the impact of the crime would continue to ripple through the lives of everyone it had touched. Jill's friends and family expressed a shared sense of relief mixed with the enduring sadness of her absence. The ruling offered a sense of closure, even if it could never fully mend the void left by her loss. In the weeks that followed, Melbourne continued to process the aftermath. Everard, community leaders and local officials gathered to discuss what had happened and what could be done to ensure such a tragedy would never happen again. Conversations around safety intensified, with residents demanding increased measures and protections, particularly for vulnerable individuals. Initiatives and programs emerged, each one a reflection of the community's commitment to creating a safer environment in memory of Jill and in solidarity with all those who had been affected by her story. Jill's memory became a powerful symbol in the community, her life celebrated in public tributes, vigils, and art. People across the city came together to honor her, using her story as a rallying point to inspire change and greater unity. Her family, though forever marked by grief, carried her legacy forward, supporting efforts to raise awareness and protect others from harm. Jill's story became more than a case. It became a call for resilience, compassion, and an unwavering dedication to justice. In time, Melbourne found ways to heal, even as the memory of that dark time remained. The community continued to grow, shaped by the lessons of Jill's story, each person holding on to the hope that they could build a world where such loss would no longer be possible. And through it all, Jill's legacy endured, a reminder of the power of unity, resilience, and the unbreakable strength of a community determined to stand together, even in the face of tragedy. If today's stories left you shocked, moved, or questioning the world around us, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Jill Thrills Stories, Gene Jail. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss our daily dives into the strange, dark, and mysterious. We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, theories, or reflections in the comments below. These conversations matter, and your perspective might shine a light on something new. Thank you for watching, stay aware, stay safe, and as always, we'll see you in the next story.